Some jobs break you before you even start. 17 secretaries had tried to last more than a month for Chicago's most demanding CEO. Not one succeeded. And now, Clara Bennett, a widowed single mother with debts she couldn't pay, was walking straight into his office. She thought she was just taking a job. She didn't know she was stepping into a storm. Rumors, betrayal, the kind of kindness that can be mistaken for something else, and a choice she never imagined: walk away to protect the man she worked for, or stay and risk everything to protect the truth. If you were in her place, knowing the world might twist your every move, would you run or would you stand your ground, even if it meant giving your heart away? This is not a fairy tale. It's a story about the small, stubborn acts of courage that change everything, and the love that can survive even in the harshest light. If this story touches you, please like the video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your words mean more than you know. Now, let's begin Clara's journey. 17 secretaries in 8 months, and not one of them lasted long enough to memorize his coffee order. The words sat at the top of the help wanted post like a dare. Clara Bennett read them twice, her hand resting on the stack of bills spread across her kitchen table. Outside her Chicago apartment, January wind shook the window pane. Inside, the chill came from the pale envelopes marked St. Catherine's Hospital. Each one another reminder that her mother's fight with cancer came with a cost that never stopped climbing. 34 years old, widowed for almost 3. Clara had long since learned to patch leaks, stretch groceries, and swallow her own worry before calling her mother each night. Since the accident that had taken her husband's life at a construction site, she'd been the only anchor for both herself and Evelyn Bennett. She scrolled down the posting: Executive Secretary, Harrington Industries. Competitive salary, high-pressure environment, discretion essential. Harrington Industries wasn't just a company, it was a skyline landmark. The 50-story glass tower in downtown Chicago gleamed like it was carved out of the winter light itself. At its top sat Grant Harrington, a man whose business instincts were legend and whose temper was whispered about in offices across the city. They called him the Steel Gentleman, a title earned not by charm, but by precision. Deals closed because he willed them to. Careers ended because he decided they would. 17 secretaries in 8 months. Some said the pace broke them. Others said his standards did. Clara read between the lines. If you're looking for comfort, don't apply. She wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for the $70,000 that would buy her mother's next round of treatment. Her resume was ready. She kept it to the facts: 10 years in administration, experience coordinating executives, the ability to keep schedules tighter than a drum. She didn't write about learning to nap upright in hospital chairs or counting coins from a glass jar to make rent. By Thursday, an email arrived with the Harrington Crest interview. Monday, 7:30 a.m. No greeting, no question about her availability, just instructions. Monday dawned sharp and cold, the kind of Chicago morning that turns every breath into a puff of white. Clara's navy dress was pressed, her black heels polished. She slipped her leather portfolio, the one her husband had given her their last Christmas, under her arm. On the train ride in, the city slid past in streaks of steel and frost. Harrington Tower rose ahead like a blade of glass against the gray sky. Inside, the lobby was all slate and brushed metal, its echo softened only by a wall of greenery. People moved quickly, their steps clipped and sure. Even the elevators seemed disciplined, opening and closing on a precise beat. At the reception desk on the 50th floor, a woman with a neat blonde bob looked up. Interview. Yes, Clara Bennett. A visitor badge slid across the desk. Visitor, Bennett. Clara. Clara clipped it to her coat and took a seat on a low-gray sofa. On the table, a copy of Chicago Business showed Grant Harrington on the cover. Tall, mid-40s, silver, threading his dark hair, gaze fixed on something far past the camera. He looked like a man measuring the horizon. She thought of the 17 who hadn't lasted. Maybe they weren't ready. Maybe the job was impossible. She sent her mother a quick sun emoji, their shared code for "I'm okay." Marlene. The receptionist's phone lit up. She nodded once, then turned to Clara. "Mr. Harrington will see you now." Clara rose, portfolio in hand, and followed her down a glass-walled corridor. Beyond the windows, the Chicago River cut a dark ribbon through the city. Conference rooms passed by, their names etched in steel forge, anvil, quarry. At the end of the hall, the corner office opened into a space stripped of anything unnecessary polished wood, clean lines, a wall of windows framing the skyline. Grant Harrington stood near the glass, hands in his pockets, the city sprawling behind him. In person, he was quieter than she'd imagined, the kind of stillness that makes a room feel smaller. When his eyes met hers, the look was steady, assessing, not unkind, not warm, more like a pilot deciding if the weather ahead could be flown through. The office felt less like a room than an arena, and Clara knew she was stepping into a test she couldn't rehearse for. Her heart steadied into a slow, deliberate beat. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone the night before, telling her the new tea tasted like lemon and sunshine. She thought of the jar of coins waiting in her cupboard, the bills on her table, the quiet promise she'd made at her husband's graveside to keep going. And then she stepped forward. "Let's begin," he said. Her first act in front of the most intimidating man in Chicago was to baptize his contract in hot coffee. The elevator doors opened onto the 50th floor, and Clara followed Marlene down a hushed corridor of glass and steel. The carpet muted their footsteps. Each step felt like crossing into thinner air cleaner, sharper, more expensive. Beyond the windows, the city sprawled in crisp lines, the river catching a slice of pale winter sun. They stopped outside the largest office at the end of the hall. The door was already open, the space beyond wide and bright. Clara stepped inside and had the fleeting thought that this was less an office than a gallery minimal, curated, every detail placed with purpose. The far wall was floor-to-ceiling glass. The skyline stretched out like a painted backdrop. Grant Harrington stood near the head of a long conference table, speaking to 3 men and 2 women in tailored suits. His posture was easy, but there was no mistaking who led the room. He glanced up briefly when Marlene announced Clara, then gestured for her to come forward without breaking his sentence. She took the seat, indicated a chair at the end of the table, facing the group. In front of her, a folder lay open. She assumed it was part of the interview materials. Her fingers itched to straighten the papers inside, but she folded her hands instead, waiting for a cue. Grant finished speaking, then turned his attention to her. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice smooth but unyielding. "Tell me how you organize chaos." She drew a breath, answered clearly, and began to outline her method color-coded calendars, layered priority lists, the habit of confirming every meeting twice. She'd barely finished her second sentence when she reached for her portfolio to produce her sample work. That's when the folder on the table caught the edge of her hand, tipping forward. The stack of documents inside slid out, fanning across the glossy surface like playing cards in slow motion. Oh, she leaned forward to gather them, her heel catching on the chair leg. Her elbow nudged the coffee cup at her side. It happened fast, the dark liquid spilling across the polished wood, curling around the edge of the folder, bleeding into the pages inside. For a heartbeat. No one moved. The scent of roasted coffee filled the air. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. Somewhere to her left, a board member's brow lifted in slow disbelief. She grabbed the stack, dabbing at the mess with a napkin offered by someone down the table. Her cheeks burned, but her voice stayed level. "I'm so sorry, let me clean that up." Grant stepped closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even sigh. He simply looked at the dripping contract in her hands, then at her. "This," he said, taking the folder and setting it aside, "is why I don't keep liquids near work I care about." The remark might have been cutting, but there was no heat behind it, just a matter-of-fact observation, as though he were noting the temperature outside. Clara met his gaze, unsure if she'd just failed a test or passed a different one. The room stayed silent until Grant spoke again, this time to the group. "We're done here. I'll see you all tomorrow." Chairs scraped back, papers were gathered, and the board members filed out without another glance at her. When the door clicked shut, he turned back to her. "Be here tomorrow at 7. That was it. No lecture, no dismissal, just an instruction, a challenge wrapped in 6 words. She nodded. "Yes, sir." He returned to his desk, already flipping open another file, signaling the conversation was over. Marlene reappeared, her expression unreadable. "This way, Ms. Bennett." Clara followed her out, the echo of those 6 words ringing in her mind. She should have felt crushed, embarrassed beyond recovery. Instead, as she rode the elevator down to the lobby, a different sensation stirred under the nerves, a flicker of curiosity. She'd expected the steel gentleman's temper. She'd expected to be dismissed on the spot. She hadn't expected restraint. Outside. The cold air met her face like a splash of water. She tightened her coat and started the walk toward the train, her heels clicking against the pavement. Tomorrow at 7. She'd be there. But she had no illusions. This wasn't just a job interview anymore. The real test hadn't even begun. If he wanted to scare her off, he had picked the wrong woman. Clara arrived at Harrington Tower the next morning at 6:55. The lobby still quiet except for the hum of heating vents pushing back the January cold. Her breath clouded faintly in the air between train and building. Now it was gone, replaced by the sharper chill of anticipation. She'd worn the same navy dress freshly pressed, and her portfolio under her arm like a shield. Marlene was already at her desk, immaculate as ever, a mug of something steaming beside her keyboard. "Mr. Harrington likes punctuality," she said without looking up, "but he values readiness more." She gestured toward a neatly stacked pile of folders. "You'll need these." By the time Clara reached the corner office, Grant was already moving phone to his ear, pen in hand, 3 separate documents open on the desk. He didn't pause when she stepped in, only gestured to a small credenza where a legal pad and pen waited. She took the hint and stood ready. The first 2 hours were a blur of calls and quick dictations, her hand cramping from keeping up with his pace. His calendar was a grid packed so tightly it looked like a mosaic. Meetings overlapped by minutes. Calls were wedged in like bookends. She realized quickly that nothing here happened by accident. Every minute had a weight, a purpose. By mid-morning, the real test arrived. At 10:15, 2 meetings collided: a quarterly review with the board of directors and a crisis conference call with a top manufacturing client whose shipment had been delayed in a snowstorm. Both were marked non-negotiable in the calendar. Grant ended his current call and looked at her. "What's next?" She read off the times, watching his eyes narrow fractionally. "Board in 10 minutes?" She finished, and Holbrook Manufacturing on the line at the same time. "Solution?" He asked. It wasn't a question for him to answer. It was for her. Her mind ran through the possibilities. She could delay one, but the board had flown in, and Holbrook represented 20% of their Q1 revenue. She could push the call, but the client was in a different time zone and already irritated. She glanced at the map in her head, the 50th floor, the available conference rooms. Forge was booked until noon. Anvil was free. "Split them," she said. "I'll set you up in Anvil with the board at 10:30. In the meantime, I'll patch Holbrook into your office for a pre-call, get their main concerns on record, and loop in procurement so you can walk straight into solutions after the board." He studied her for half a beat, then gave a short nod. "Do it." The next 15 minutes were a sprint. She rerouted calls, found the procurement director in another meeting, and pulled him out with a single sentence, "Holbrook is holding." She carried the client's frustration across the hall in bullet points and set a glass of water at Grant's place in the boardroom before the directors even sat down. By 10:30 he was shaking hands with the board as if nothing had been amiss. 10 minutes later, she heard his voice in the office already deep into solutions with Holbrook while the board pored over quarterly numbers next door. When both meetings wrapped within 5 minutes of each other, he returned to his desk. Neither side knew they weren't first priority. He said, almost to himself. Clara didn't answer. She was busy clearing the call notes, stacking them neatly for him to review. But inside, she felt the faint, steady hum of having done something right. The rest of the day didn't let up. There were supplier negotiations to schedule, a misrouted invoice to chase down, and a last-minute luncheon with a visiting senator's aide. Lunch came in the form of a protein bar eaten at her desk between calls. By 4 o'clock, her to-do list had doubled instead of shrinking. Near the end of the day, as she was finalizing the next day's itinerary, Grant stopped at her desk. For the first time since she'd started, he wasn't in motion. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her finish typing. She looked up. Yes. "Mr. Harrington." His gaze held hers for a long moment, unreadable but sharper than before. "Can you keep this up?" Her lips curved into the smallest smile. "We'll find out." Something flickered in his eyes, not approval exactly, but recognition. He gave a short nod and returned to his office. Clara gathered her things after he left for the evening, the city lights glittering beyond the glass. She was tired down to her bones, but it wasn't the hollow kind of tired. This was earned. As she rode the elevator down, she replayed his question in her mind. "Can you keep this up?" It was less a warning than an invitation to prove she belonged here. It wasn't the grand gestures that made her pause. It was the way he noticed the smallest things. By her second week, Clara had adjusted to the relentless current of Harrington Industries. Mornings started at a sprint and didn't slow until the elevator ride down at night. There was no idle chatter here, no wasted minutes. If you kept up, you belonged. If not, the pace simply left you behind. Still, patterns emerged, small rituals in the rush. Grant took his first call at 7:02 sharp. The board liked to meet in Forge rather than Anvil. The procurement director always carried 2 phones, one for work, one for his kids' texts. Clara noticed these details because they mattered. What surprised her was when someone noticed details about her. It happened on a Tuesday. She'd returned from delivering signed contracts to legal to find a steaming mug on her desk. Peppermint tea. She blinked, certain she hadn't told anyone about her preference. Coffee made her jittery, and herbal tea was her quiet armor against the grind of long days. She glanced toward the corner office. Grant was on a call, one hand resting on his desk, the other jotting notes in a tight, even script. He didn't look over, no acknowledgement, but she knew. 2 days later, the workday devoured lunch entirely. Back-to-back investor briefings, a last-minute supplier call, and a hiccup in the production schedule had kept them both in constant motion. It was nearly 2 o'clock when Grant emerged from his office with a small paper bag. He set it on her desk without breaking stride toward the elevators. Inside a turkey sandwich, cut diagonally, wrapped neatly in paper. On top, a sticky note with a single word in his handwriting. Eat. It wasn't dramatic, but the effect lingered. No one else in that building had time to think about whether she'd eaten. By Friday afternoon, the 50th floor was unusually quiet, half the staff gone to a weekend conference in Denver. The winter light poured in low and gold, softening the edges of the glass and steel. Clara was updating the vendor list when Grant appeared at her desk, hands in his pockets. "Walk," he said. She hesitated, glancing at the time, then nodded. They ended up on the rooftop garden, a hidden patch of stone paths and evergreens, open to the cold sky. The city stretched around them in every direction, the river glinting faintly in the distance. The air was sharp enough to see their breath, but the sun gave it a pale warmth. For a while, they stood without speaking, the noise of the city muffled by height and glass. Then he asked, "You're from the North Side, born and raised. You West Suburbs. Left at 18 and didn't look back." He gave a faint, almost private smile. "Family business went under in 92. My father didn't handle it well. I decided if I ever built something, it would stand." There was no drama in his tone, just the steady voice of a man stating a fact that had shaped every choice since. Clara hesitated, then offered her own truth. "I've always wanted to build something too, not an empire, just a bookstore, small, cozy, a little coffee counter, the kind of place people come back to because it feels like home." He turned his head, studying her as if weighing whether she meant it. "What's stopping you?" She laughed once, not bitterly, but with the dry honesty of someone counting every penny. "About 70,000 reasons, most of them with interest." They stood in companionable quiet for a few moments. The wind lifted her hair, his coat shifted in the breeze. There was something unspoken in that stillness, an understanding that both carried walls built from hard history, and that maybe, just maybe, each could see the cracks in the others. When they returned to the office, Clara noticed her steps felt lighter. The afternoon passed in a calmer rhythm. She handled a last-minute reschedule with the ease of muscle memory, drafted a vendor update, and set the final agenda for Monday's staff meeting. It was almost 5 when her phone buzzed. She saw the caller ID and felt her breath catch St. Catherine's Hospital. She answered. A voice on the other end began to speak, measured but urgent. The words blurred around the edges, but the tone was enough. The room seemed to tilt, her hand tightening around the phone. She caught only fragments test results, further complications, next steps, but the meaning landed with a cold, heavy certainty. When she hung up, the winter light outside had shifted to dusk. The 50th floor was nearly empty now. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear the faint murmur of Grant's voice finishing a call. Clara stared at her desk for a moment, her pulse steady, but her chest tight. Whatever came next, she knew this, she couldn't outrun it. Hope came with a price tag she could never afford. The call from St. Catherine's replayed in Clara's mind long after she hung up. The oncologist's voice was calm, but the words landed heavy. Her mother's best chance now was a new drug costing $70,000, due up front, and not covered by insurance. Appeals would take weeks, maybe months. They didn't have that kind of time. By the time she reached her apartment that night, she had already gone through her bank accounts twice. Savings gone after the last hospital stay. Credit cards maxed. She called the bank anyway, hoping for a miracle. They offered polite regrets and a brochure on small business loans she didn't qualify for. She made 2 more calls, old friends from her previous job. They offered prayers, casseroles, rides to appointments, all kindnesses, but none that could buy medicine. The next morning, she arrived at Harrington Tower with the same careful mask she wore in most Storm's press dress, steady walk, eyes forward. She kept her head down, moving through the morning tasks until a shadow fell across her desk. "Clara," Grant said, low enough that no one else would hear. She looked up. Something in her expression must have betrayed her, because his voice softened, though his words were direct. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, then told him. Not every detail, just enough: the drug, the cost, the clock ticking. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said simply, "I'll cover it." She blinked. "Grant, that's not—" "It is?" He said. "No strings. You tell the hospital where to send the invoice." Her first instinct was to refuse. Pride is a stubborn thing, even in the shadow of desperation. "I don't want to owe you." "You won't," he replied. "You'll owe the doctors. I'll handle the money." Something in his tone, firm but without the usual edge, cut through her resistance. She nodded, the words, "Thank you," catching in her throat. Within an hour, the transfer was set. He handled it like he would any urgent business transaction, with a calm that made it feel less like charity and more like logistics. When the day's last meeting ended, he told her, "Come with me." They walked to a small restaurant along Lake Michigan, one of those places locals kept for themselves. The windows fogged against the cold outside, and the smell of soup and fresh bread wrapped around them as they sat. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that comes when both people are carrying more than words can fix. Then, over half-empty bowls, Grant spoke. "I used to come here with my wife. She had a heart condition. We knew our time was limited. This place was where we remembered that life wasn't all about control." Clara set down her spoon. "I didn't know you were married." 6 years ago, he said quietly. "She's been gone for 5. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Loss was a language she spoke, and she knew when not to ask for translation. In return, she told him about her mother, how Evelyn used to take her to the library every Saturday, how she'd sneak extra sugar into Clara's tea when her father wasn't looking, how she now insisted she was fine even when her strength was fading. By the time they left, the lake was a dark expanse under a pale slice of moon. They walked in silence back to the tower, the wind biting at their coats. Something had shifted, not in any grand, sweeping way, but in the quiet recognition that comes when 2 people let their guard down, even for a moment. 2 days later, the first infusion began. Clara sat beside her mother, watching color return faintly to her cheeks. The doctor was cautious, but the early signs were promising. "It's too soon to say," he warned, "but this is a good start." That night, Clara sent a short message to the work number she usually kept for scheduling and reports. "Thank you." She didn't know what it meant yet, that help, that night by the lake, but she knew this much: the line between employer and something else had started to blur. Just when the light returned, the shadows deepened again. For a few bright days, hope felt simple. The first infusion gave Evelyn a touch of color and a little appetite. She asked for oatmeal with cinnamon. She laughed at a nurse's joke about hospital socks. Clara took a photo of her holding a paperback, IV taped neatly in place, and for the first time in months sent a picture to friends without a long disclaimer underneath. St. Catherine's ran on its own steady clock: med times, vitals, rounds. Clara learned the rhythm fast. She came early with peppermint tea in a thermos, rubbed lotion into her mother's hands so the skin wouldn't crack, and read aloud from the books that once tucked her into sleep. She skipped the sad parts. Evelyn noticed, smiled, and let it go. Grant visited without ceremony. He brought a florist's small bouquet instead of a towering arrangement, as if he understood the difference between beauty and burden. He stood when the doctor entered, stepped back when the nurse needed space, and took notes like a second pair of ears. If Clara had to slip back to the office for a meeting, he stayed. Later, Evelyn said, "He's polite." And he listens, as if those two things were rarer than roses. On the fifth day, the doctor's tone shifted. Not grim, careful. He spoke of scans and markers that weren't behaving as hoped. "It may be transient," he said. "We'll know more after the next round." His voice wrapped concern in caution, and the room absorbed both. By the seventh day, the light dulled. Breath came shorter. A bruise-colored fatigue settled under Evelyn's eyes. She waved off the paperback and asked for quiet. The winter sun slid across the blanket like a thin shawl. The second infusion didn't land the way the first had. Nausea came hard. Pain needed more medicine to stay ahead of it. Nurses worked with practiced tenderness, and still the hours stretched taut. Clara sat in the vinyl chair, legs tucked under, palm pressed to her temple as if she could hold back the tide by will alone. She had always been good at pushing through deadlines, bills, grief postponed until the next task was done. This was different. This was weather. You could brace, you could build a wall, and still the water found a way in. One quiet afternoon, when monitors hummed like distant bees and the floor had settled. Evelyn turned her head. Her voice was thin, but it carried the old authority that had taught Clara to look both ways, to lace shoes tight, to say please and thank you and mean them. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "come closer." Clara leaned in until their foreheads almost touched. She could smell lemon soap and the lavender lotion brought from home. "Don't hide from love just because it scares you," Evelyn said. The words took a beat to land, and then they did an instruction and a blessing intertwined. "I'm not hiding," Clara murmured. "You've always been brave," Evelyn said, "but brave isn't only holding on. Sometimes it's letting go of the picture you thought life had to be." Clara nodded, throat tight. She didn't say Grant's name. She didn't have to. A mother knows the shape of things before her child can name them. That evening, after a doze that felt like sinking and a startle back to wakefulness, Clara found Grant in the hallway speaking quietly with a nurse. When he turned, she saw the question in his eyes and shook her head. His expression didn't change much, but he reached and touched her elbow once, steady like a person anchoring another in a storm. Morning began with a dusting of snow. The oncologist came early, kind and direct. "We're seeing spread," he said. "We can keep her comfortable. It won't be long." The words took up space the way equipment does necessary and cold. The nurse brought paperwork. Clara signed the lines for comfort care with a hand that didn't quite feel like hers. They made a small world out of that room. Grant queued up soft music, old songs digitized, just enough to warm the air without asking for attention. The chaplain stopped by and asked if anyone needed prayer. "We have it!" Evelyn smiled, and the chaplain seemed to understand. When she slept? Clara walked the long corridor to the vending machine and chose the same salted crackers she'd eaten on childhood road trips. She ate them without tasting and went back in, because going back in is what love does. Late that night, when the floor was at its quietest and the world narrowed to a handful of streetlights and the white breath of the snowplow, it became time. There is no bell for it. Nurses know. Daughters do, too, even if they tell themselves they don't. Evelyn's breathing changed softer, shallower, edges rounding off like waves losing strength. Clara leaned close. "I'm here. Mom." Grant stood at the foot of the bed, not apart and not in the way, simply present. When Clara's voice broke on the word "here," his hand found her shoulder, the simple weight of it saying what language cannot carry. Evelyn's last look was like so many first ones, steady, proud, bright, with a love that keeps no clock. She breathed out and did not breathe in again. The nurse listened with a stethoscope, checked a watch, nodded. The room didn't change, and everything did. They removed the IV with care, lowered the rail, smoothed the sheet. Mercy wears many shapes. Sometimes it looks like neatness. Clara put her head on the bed and let the kind of tears come that do not ask permission. Grief shook her, but did not shatter her. There was strength inside it, the kind that comes when love has done its whole work. Grant spoke quietly to the nurse, made one phone call she didn't have to make, and returned with water he held until she remembered her hands. The snow stopped before dawn. The parking lot shone under tall lamps. Morning began in that blunt hospital way, fresh linens, breakfast trays, alarms. The world continued, which is one of grief's meanest tricks, and also its rescue. The arrangements were simple. Evelyn had asked for that, and Clara honored it. A short service. The pastor who'd known them since Sunday school spoke about hands that cooked for potlucks and folded laundry and cupped a daughter's cheek in blessing. Neighbors brought food, because that is what people do. Someone left a casserole on the porch with a note. No need to return the dish. Clara smiled through tears. Her mother would have returned it spotless, with a thank you card anyway. Time went soft for a few days. Sleep arrived when it pleased. Meals were whatever someone set in front of her. When Clara finally stepped back into Harrington Tower, the glass and light felt almost too clear. The 50th floor hummed at its usual pitch, heads lifted, voices lowered. Marlene rose and hugged her the way offices allow brief, careful, sincere. Clara set her bag down and opened her planner as if inked lines could anchor what kept drifting. The first email she answered was simple. The second took effort. By the third, she felt the room tilt again, the muscle memory of competence pushing against the ache that had settled beneath her ribs. Late morning, Grant stopped at her desk. He didn't ask, "How are you?" a question with no honest answer yet. He didn't say, "Take your time." He rested his hands on the desk's edge and said, "We'll go slow today." The sentence made space without making her feel fragile. She nodded, grateful for its plainness. She made it to lunch. She made it to 2, at 3. She stood by the window and watched the river slide under a pale sky and reminded herself to breathe. Work could be a raft, she thought. It could also be a weight. She wasn't sure yet which this would be. Her phone buzzed. A preview line crept across the screen, sharp enough to cut media inquiry. "Mr. Harrington." She frowned, opened it, and felt the floor shift once more. Her grief hadn't even settled when her face was plastered across the business section. It started with a text from Marlene. "Don't look at the news until you talk to Grant." By the time Clara reached her desk, 3 more messages had lit up her phone, one from an old college friend, one from a neighbor, and one from a number she didn't recognize that simply read, "Is it true?" The headline waited on her monitor. Impossible to ignore. Millionaire CEO's special assistant receives $70,000 payout amid romance rumors. Beneath it, a grainy photo. Grant and Clara leaving the Lake Michigan Cafe. Winter coats buttoned against the wind. In her hand, a paper bag holding leftover pie. In his, the door he'd held open for her. The caption made it sound like proof. The article detailed the unexplained transfer from Harrington Industries to St. Catherine's, conveniently omitting the words oncology or treatment. Anonymous former employees claimed Grant had a history of favoring certain assistants. One even suggested that Clara's promotion to work directly for him had been part of a personal arrangement. Her stomach turned. Every kindness he'd shown her was now twisted into something ugly. And the truth, the only thing that mattered, was buried under a story built to sting. When she looked up, Grant was in her doorway, no tie today, just a dark suit and the quiet kind of anger that didn't need to raise its voice. He closed the door behind him. "It's fabricated," he said, "mostly from one source, a former senior aide I fired for breach of contract. They're selling it as scandal because it's cleaner than the truth." "The money," she said, "was for I know what it was for." His tone softened. "So do you. That's enough." But it wasn't enough, not when she could already feel eyes on her in the hallway, the pause in conversations when she passed. "They'll tear into you," she said, "your name, your company. This could stick." He leaned against the desk, arms folded. "I've weathered worse. I'm more concerned about you." She wanted to believe him, but the numbers wouldn't leave her mind. Stock prices, client contracts, reputations that took decades to build. She knew how quickly trust eroded once a seed of doubt was planted, and she knew she was the seed in this story. That afternoon, the first reporter called her cell. She didn't answer. The second email came from a journalist she'd met years ago. It was almost polite in tone, asking if she'd like to share her side before others define it for her. She deleted it without replying. In the break room, she caught the tail end of two co-workers whispering. When they noticed her, one of them flushed and reached for a mug. "Sorry," they murmured. By the end of the day, Clara's mind had mapped the only escape she could see leave before the rumors hardened, before her presence did real harm. She imagined packing up her desk, drafting a resignation letter that framed it as personal reasons, vanishing from the 50th floor before Monday. The thought hit low in her chest, aching in a way that had nothing to do with pride. She didn't want to leave. She wanted the quiet moments of competence, the calendar tamed into order, the satisfaction of smoothing a problem before it reached his desk. She wanted the small, human proofs that the man in the headlines was not the man in the corner office. That evening, she stayed late, waiting for the floor to empty. The city outside was sharp with cold. The river glinted under the bridge lights. She opened her resignation draft on the screen, fingers hovering over the keys. She didn't hear Grant come in until he spoke. "If you're writing what I think you're writing, close it." She turned. "This isn't just about me." "Exactly," he said. "It's about both of us. And I won't have you take the fall for lies someone else built." She shook her head. "Grant, this could cost you clients. The board. The board will get the truth. So will the clients. And if they can't live with it, I'll live without them." It was reckless. It was loyal. And it was the kind of sentence that could undo a person if they weren't careful. She closed the document, but didn't delete it. What's the plan? Then his mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like the outline of one. "We tell the truth, loudly, on our terms." Her pulse steadied in a way she hadn't expected. Leaving would have been the safer road. But she'd been raised by a woman who believed in facing storms head-on, and she'd been reminded just days ago not to hide from love, or from anything that mattered, just because it scared her. When she left the building that night, the wind cut sharp off the lake. She pulled her scarf tighter, head down against the cold, but her steps were even, her spine straight. She wasn't running. Not this time. If they wanted a story, she'd give them the real one. 2 mornings after the headline broke. Clara walked into a coffee shop on the near north side with a folder under her arm and a weight in her chest. At the corner table sat Dana Whitaker, senior features reporter for the Chicago Ledger. Dana was known for two things: her unwillingness to print a story she couldn't defend, and her ability to get people to talk without realizing they were doing it. Clara set the folder down before sitting. "You said you wanted my side. Here it is." Dana didn't touch the folder immediately. "Off the record until you say otherwise." "Not off the record," Clara said. "On it. Every word." She opened the folder and laid out the first stack: Evelyn Bennett's medical records, the oncologist's letter, billing statements from St. Catherine's marked paid in precise hospital print. "That's the $70,000, Clara said. "Every cent went to my mother's treatment." Grant Harrington never saw a receipt, never asked for one. He just paid the hospital directly. Dana's pen hovered. "And your relationship with him." Clara slid over a single sheet her resignation letter, dated 3 months before the Lake Michigan dinner photo. "This was written the week I interviewed for Harrington Industries. I kept it in my desk in case the job didn't work out. I didn't know him. I didn't have anything with him. Not then." The next set of documents was an internal HR statement signed by 3 current employees, each confirming that they had never seen nor been asked to participate in any inappropriate arrangements. One had worked under Grant for 7 years. Another had been on the board's administrative oversight committee. "They volunteered to write these," Clara said. "No one asked." Dana flipped slowly through each page, occasionally making a note. And the former senior aide, the one who spoke to the other paper, Clara's jaw tightened. Grant terminated her last year for leaking confidential client files to a competitor. The competitor just happened to be her next employer. She signed a non-disclosure agreement and broke it. The payout she mentioned, that was severance minus damages. Dana's brows lifted. "You've done your homework. I've lived it," Clara said. They sat in the hum of espresso machines and soft jazz while Dana read every word. When she was done, she closed the folder and leaned back. "You realize you're handing me the keys to burn the first article to the ground." "I'm handing you the truth," Clara said. "What you do with it is yours to own." Dana's gaze sharpened. "And you're not worried this will look like damage control?" "It is damage control," Clara said evenly. "For the truth. If you want a scandal, keep what's out there now. If you want a story worth your name, print this." There was a long pause. Then Dana smiled. Small and a little dangerous. "I'll need a quote from Harrington." "Not the company. Him. He'll give it," Clara said, hoping she was right. By the next morning, the Ledger's headline read, "Inside the Story. Harrington's critics got wrong." The subhead pulled no punches, from a daughter's desperation to a CEO's quiet gift. The $70,000 wasn't what you think. The piece wove Clara's evidence into a narrative that was both personal and factual. It explained Evelyn's diagnosis, the cost of the medication, and the hospital payment made directly from company accounts. It cited the HR statements and detailed the former aide's breach of contract and subsequent lawsuit dismissed in court. The Lake Michigan photo was reframed not as a romantic rendezvous, but as a quiet dinner between 2 people shouldering more than they could say out loud. And in the final third, it quoted Grant directly. "Acts of compassion don't require justification, but when someone's integrity is attacked, the truth deserves daylight." The article spread fast first in business circles, then across social feeds where readers posted comments like, "The other paper owes them an apology," and "More CEOs should spend money this way." The tide didn't turn overnight, But it shifted. For the first time in a week, Clara walked into the Harrington lobby without feeling every gaze on her back. Some smiled. Marlene handed her a coffee and said, "Good work," in the same tone she'd use for a flawless quarterly report. By mid-afternoon, she was halfway through clearing a client backlog when her desk phone rang. The caller ID was internal. Clara Bennett. She answered. "Read it." Grant's voice said, "No greeting, no preamble." "I saw," she said. Silence stretched a beat. Then another. His tone, when it came again, was different, not the clipped authority of a CEO or the polite reserve of a man who keeps walls in place, but something warmer, more deliberate. "Thank you," he said, "for not running. For everything." Her throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "We agreed. We face it on our terms." A low sound, half approval, half something else came through the line. "Dinner tonight. My turn to buy." She almost smiled. That wasn't part of the agreement. Consider it an amendment. When the line clicked dead, Clara sat back in her chair, pulse steady but high, and realized that the storm outside the building had gone strangely quiet. The truth was out now. It was time to live with it. The Ledger article had done its work. The stares in the lobby faded into nods. The whispers turned into greetings. By the end of the week, Grant and Clara could walk side by side through the building without the air around them tightening. They didn't make an announcement in the formal sense, but neither of them flinched when his hand brushed hers in the elevator or when she laughed too loudly at something he said in the cafe downstairs. It was no longer about hiding. It was about breathing. One Saturday in late March, Grant met her at the gate of St. Catherine's Memorial Gardens. The air was damp with the first hints of spring. Crocuses had started to push through the soft ground. Clara carried a small bouquet of lavender and daisies, her mother's favorites, and Grant brought nothing but himself, which felt like enough. They walked the narrow path to Evelyn Bennett's grave. The headstone was simple, exactly as she'd wanted. Clara knelt to lay the flowers, brushing away a few stray leaves. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind that lets you hear your own pulse. "Finally," Clara said. "She told me not to hide from love just because it scared me." Grant stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes on the engraving. "Smart woman." "She'd have liked you," Clara said. "I'd have liked her too," he replied, his voice softer than she'd heard in weeks. They stayed until the light began to fade, the city's hum reaching them from beyond the gates. Walking back, she slipped her hand into his, and he didn't let go. The weeks that followed were quieter, almost gentle. Work found its rhythm again. Contracts were signed, meetings held, deadlines met. Yet the boundary between CEO and secretary and Grant and Clara was no longer an invisible fence. It was a line they had stepped across together, eyes open. One evening, after a long day of back-to-back board meetings, Grant called her into his office. The skyline behind him glowed gold with the setting sun. "I've been thinking," he said, "about your bookstore." She smiled faintly. "The one I can't afford." "The one you're going to have," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside was a preliminary business plan, location options, startup cost projections, even a note on suppliers for both books and coffee. Her breath caught. "You did all this, I had help," he admitted. "But yes, and I think you should do it." She looked up sharply. "Grant, I can't run a store and work here exactly." He leaned forward. "I'm asking you to leave Harrington Industries." The words hit like a stone dropped in still water ripples of shock, fear, and something warmer she didn't want to name too quickly. "You're firing me, I'm freeing you," he said simply. You've spent years making other people's visions work. It's time for yours. Her fingers traced the edge of the folder. And us. We're not built on job titles, he said. If anything, we'll be stronger without this office between us. It wasn't the grand romantic proposal some women might have imagined, but Clara felt her chest tighten with the weight of it anyway. He was offering her something bigger than a corner office or a promotion. He was offering her the space to be herself, fully. She sat back, letting the thought settle. For years, she'd measured safety by steady paychecks, by predictability. But her mother's voice, "Don't hide from love," wasn't only about romance. It was about stepping into any life that asked you to be braver than you thought you could be. "When do I start?" she asked. Grant smiled small, genuine, with the rare ease of a man letting his guard down. "Tomorrow, if you want. I'll miss having you here, but I'll like knowing where to find you." A year later. The morning light spilled across a narrow storefront on a quiet Chicago street. The windows gleamed, the wood sign above freshly painted Bennett's Books and Brews. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of paper and ink. The shelves held a careful mix: literary classics, local authors, children's favorites. A small counter in the corner offered scones and cappuccinos to customers who lingered in the mismatched armchairs. On the wall behind the register hung a framed photograph of Evelyn Bennett, laughing over a book in her lap. Below it, in smaller frame, a clipping from the Ledger article, the one that had turned a rumor into a truth worth telling. The bell over the door chimed. Grant stepped in, holding 2 to-go cups from a place down the block. "For the owner," he said, setting one on the counter. Clara smiled, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I thought we serve coffee here. Sometimes it's nice to be the customer," he said. She looked around the shop, the people leafing through novels, the hiss of the espresso machine, the way the morning sun fell across the floor, and felt something she hadn't in years: steady, rooted joy. The truth was out. They had lived with it, and now they were building something new, in the light. Some love stories don't end with castles, they end where they began. The street outside Bennett's Books and Brews was alive with a soft spring bustle. The awning over the shop's wide windows swayed in the breeze, and the chalkboard sign on the sidewalk read, in Clara's neat script, grand opening, "Come in, stay a while." She'd been at the store since before sunrise, arranging stacks of books on the central table, checking the espresso machine twice, and setting the last of the fresh scones behind glass. Friends from the neighborhood had come early to help, just as they'd promised months ago. Marlene, retired now and glowing with the freedom of it, had insisted on tying the ribbons around the first batch of gift-wrapped books. Presentation matters, she'd said with the same certainty she used to reserve for color-coding board packets. Grant had been there too, moving through the space without drawing attention, fixing a squeaky hinge on the back door, carrying boxes no one else could lift without swearing, refilling the vase by the register without a word. He wore jeans and a light sweater instead of a suit. If any of the customers recognized him as the CEO, whose name still filled business headlines, they didn't say. By mid-morning, the shop was full. A group of teenagers browsed the young adult shelves. A couple in their 60s lingered over coffee, flipping through travel guides. A man in a Cubs cap sat by the window, lost in a paperback. It was there, on the sill beside him, that Clara noticed a small bouquet of lavender tied with a thin white ribbon. She froze for a moment, her throat tightening. She hadn't put it there. Neither had Marlene. She turned toward Grant. "Was that you?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "I think it was someone who knew her." She stepped closer to the window. The flowers were fresh. their scent rising warm in the sunlight. She thought of Evelyn's hands cradling tea mugs, her laugh in the kitchen, her voice telling her not to hide from love just because it scared her. The ache was still there, but today it felt like an ache you could live with, an ache you'd choose, because it meant you'd had something worth missing. Around noon, Clara slipped outside to stand under the awning. The breeze carried the smell of coffee and paper onto the street. From here, she could see the sign above the door, her name, her mother's name, painted in warm gold letters. She felt the weight of every step that had brought her here, the job no one survived, the spilled coffee, the impossible schedules, the whispered rumors, the headlines, the nights by her mother's hospital bed. The choice to stay when running would have been easier. Grant joined her, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. He passed her one, their fingers brushing. "It's good," he said, glancing at the full tables inside. "It's ours," she said, and the word felt right on her tongue. For a moment, they just watched the street together. A busker across the road played an old jazz standard. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the awning in bright color. Grant turned to her. "You know," he said, "when I told you to leave Harrington Industries, I thought I was giving you something, but I think you were the one giving me something all along." She smiled, eyes on the shop. "What's that, a place to land?" he said simply. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth settle into her chest. He was right. They'd both found a place to land, even if they'd taken different roads to get here. "Inside," Marlene called out. "Clara, you're missing the ribbon cutting." They stepped back in together. The crowd clapped as Clara took the scissors, Grant at her side. The ribbon fell in a clean, satisfying snap, and the shop officially belonged to its customers as much as it did to her. Later, after the rush eased and the last of the gift bags had been handed out, Clara stood behind the counter, watching the late afternoon light slide across the shelves. She could hear Grant in the corner, helping a man choose a book for his wife's birthday. Marlene was wiping tables with the precision of someone who took pride in doing things right. Clara felt it then, not just happiness, but the quiet certainty that she had truly come home. Not to the apartment where she'd lived before, not to the tower where she'd fought to prove herself, but to a life built with her own hands and shared with someone who knew what it meant to show up when it mattered. As the last customers left and the shop settled into evening, Grant came to stand beside her at the counter. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. He nodded once, as if sealing an agreement neither of them needed to sign. She looked around the shop one more time. The lavender by the window caught the last of the sunlight, glowing faintly against the glass. She thought of her mother's words, the ones that had carried her through grief and fear and every twist she hadn't seen coming. Be brave. Choose love. Clara reached for Grant's hand. He took it without hesitation. And in the warm, book-scented air of Bennett's Books and Brews, she knew she had done both. Clara's story reminds us that courage often comes in quiet, everyday choices. Sometimes, bravery isn't about charging into danger. It's about staying when it would be easier to walk away, or trusting someone when you've been taught to guard your heart. She faced loss, judgment, and the weight of other people's opinions, yet she chose to act with integrity rather than fear. Her journey also teaches that love, whether for family, for a partner, or for a dream, requires vulnerability. You cannot protect yourself from every hurt and still expect to feel deeply. Clara's decision to open her heart, to build something new even after grief, shows us that the risk of love is worth its rewards. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is this home is not just a place. It's where your values, your work, and your relationships align. It's where you can stand in the light without hiding any part of yourself. For anyone feeling uncertain or afraid, remember Evelyn's words to her daughter. Be brave. Choose love. Those choices, more than any circumstance, shape the life we carry forward. Thank you so much for spending your time with Clara's story. If her journey touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need its message today, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us keep telling the kinds of stories that inspire, comfort, and remind us all to be brave and choose love.